This is going to be all the way from here. That's as good as it's going to get. Welcome, I'm Pete Miller. I am the chair of the Wilmot Democrats, and thank you all for joining us both here in person and on Zoom. We're very fortunate, but first we need to give some thanks to the Wilmot Community Association. If you don't know the Wilmot Community Association, it runs this Red Barn facility, which has educational activities, art activities, music activities, get-together, community activities, and it's a great source of community togetherness here in Wilmot. So if you want, there is information on a table outside about them. So thank you. We also want to thank our co-sponsors. We have the Andover Democratic Committee, we have Pembroke, we have Salisbury, we have Sunapee, and we have Warner. And there are others like from Webster who are spreading the word. Thank you so much, all of you. We are very fortunate to have Andy Volinsky with us today. Essentially, Andy has been involved with this for a generation. And I know it's a generation because I can remember living in my apartment in Lebanon in 1993 and reading in the Valley News about this really historic decision that the New Hampshire Supreme Court said that we, as a state, had an obligation to pony up more, constitutional requirement to pony up more. And I can remember that because my son, who was then a baby, is now 31. So that was a generation ago. And here Andy has continued this very important effort upon, which is really on the behalf of all of us. He's continuing it now. There's a suit that involves Rand's Hardware of Plymouth, and there's also a plaintiff in Pennacook, and there's one in Newport and one in another town, Hopkinton, thank you. Because here we are a generation later, and we still have an unequal, unconstitutional setup. So what we're here today is to find out the facts. Andy has been involved with this for many, many years. He's an attorney. He has a wonderful background. He's involved with civil rights in the South, and among other things, he's served as an executive counselor. He's been a candidate for governor. And in addition to that form of public service, what the public service that he's presenting today is a fact-based presentation. And we say that this is a nonpartisan presentation in the sense that it's fact-based, okay? And Daniel Patrick Moynihan, of course, had the very well-known statement about people being entitled to their opinions, but not their own set of facts, so that we can all have the facts, go forward, and to make educated decisions as a community. So without further ado, can we welcome Andy, who is our presenter today. Thank you.
So I stand here like this, and then like this. The people who would like to see me indicted would be all set with the booking process. Are we on share screen now? Okay, so this isn't my computer. So we use a PowerPoint to walk us through, sorry. Well, it doesn't matter anymore because we're on share screen, so I can wander a little bit. We're going to walk through some of the historical facts, a lot of the financial facts, a little bit of legal arguments. If you have questions, just raise your hand, shout it out. If it's something that I'm going to address a little bit later in the presentation, I'll just tell you that. And don't worry about throwing me off. All right, so I guess we do that. So the basic question is education an important constitutional right, fundamental constitutional right? And most people, when you ask that question, think about the US Constitution. And so if you ask that question about the US Constitution, you run into this case. San Antonio Independent Schools versus Rodriguez, 1973 case. Brought by a group of petitioners in the Edgewood School District, which was inner city, low value property, mostly Mexican American. in the same city, I think there were 5 or 6 school districts, the wealthiest of which was the Alamo Heights School District. Property's worth a lot more, almost all white, very few minority kids in the school district. At the time, the Texas school funding system relied 50% on local property taxes, and they were raised in each of these 6 districts. So remember that number, 50%. That's what caused the disparity. And since this was 1973, so almost 50 years ago, the Alamo Heights kids had about $550 spent on each of their educations, and the Edgewood kids had about $340. So at the time, appropriate numbers, big difference between the two. Edgewood had a much higher tax rate than Alamo Heights, so they couldn't tax themselves out of the deficiency. And because their kids were mostly poor kids, English language learners, things like that, the kids had higher needs and should have gotten higher spending rather than lower spending. So why does the property value matter? I just try and tell people it's simple math. So I dropped a bunch of zeros. If you have $10 of available property to tax for every kid in your school district, and you levy a $2 tax, well, then you raise $20 for that kid's education. But if your property value is only $1 per child, and you levy twice as much in tax, so you're becoming competitively disadvantaged, you're still way behind. That's what a property tax-based system does. And in the Texas system, it was half the money came from this scheme. And so in that case, the majority led by Lewis Powell said that education is not a fundamental right protected by the US Constitution. And he reduced it to a non-fundamental right, which means that almost any state justification for the system, short of complete denial, passes muster. So if it's a fundamental right, like speech or the right to vote, state infringement on those rights has to be justified by a compelling reason. And so the burden of proof is on the state to justify what they do. If it's not a fundamental right, low level of scrutiny, the person challenging the state has to challenge the state's conduct, has the burden of proof. The reason they came to this conclusion that it's not a fundamental right is that the word education is not mentioned in the federal constitution. Funny thing, this is 1973. Can anyone think of another case decided in 1973 that's kind of important these days? Yeah, so Roe was decided the same year. Powell voted, to my mind, correctly in Roe to recognize reproductive rights as a fundamental right. Abortion, privacy, reproduction, none of that in the federal constitution. It's all implied. So we switched tests to negate the efforts of the Edgewood plaintiffs to support the efforts of the Roe group who support abortion and reproductive rights. 2 footnotes about Powell. Some of you may know of the Powell memo. That was the precursor, the beginning of the Koch brothers kind of money-raising, influence peddling, Federalist Society take over the judiciary effort. Powell's the one who wrote the most influential memo that started that effort. There's a really good book called Democracy in Chains by Nancy McLean, who writes about what became the Virginia School of Economics, a professor named Buchanan was recruited by the then president of UVA, a guy named Darden. Darden and Powell were buddies. So they're all in the same group. A lot of this idea of making economically disadvantaged people and groups less competitive comes from Powell. And the San Antonio schools case is right along with it. Now, Powell says it's not a fundamental right because the federal constitution doesn't mention it. Thurgood Marshall writes in dissent, hey, buddy, the Texas Constitution mentions it. And so a bunch of smart lawyers in the 70s start bringing all of these same cases using their state constitutions. And Texas is one of the leaders in that area. Yeah.
Pardon my ignorance. So if it's not in the federal constitution, then you can't use the state assertion of a state constitutional right to try it in federal court, or
So there are parallel constitutions, federal and just about
yeah,
each,
I had
each
third
state.
grade civics. We can
Okay.
go over that.
All right. In order to get jurisdiction in a federal court, you have to have a federal right at issue. State
what I'm asking.
constitutional
Can't use a
issues,
state constitutional issue in federal court.
right? You
Thank
litigate those in state court. This is our education clause. We didn't want to work too hard, so we just copied what Massachusetts wrote. John Adams actually wrote that. Come on.
People.
So with share screen, they have me as well? Oh. It's a little tiny. Don't worry about it. Just look at the screen. All right, so John Adams wrote this. We adopted it as part of our constitution in 1784, mentions education directly. So now we're on a different footing than the Edgewood petitioners in the federal case, because education wasn't mentioned directly. So we brought the Claremont School District case in 1991. So Peter mentioned your son. When we filed, we have 3 kids. Our son is the eldest and then 2 daughters. My wife, Amy, had one girl by the hand and the other girl in the backpack when we filed. The younger one in the backpack turned 32 today. That's how long this has been going on in our case. And I'll spare you all the gory details of our case, because I want to get more to the present. But there are 2 takeaways from the 10 trips we made to the New Hampshire Supreme Court on Claremont cases. The first takeaway is the duty to provide an constitutionally adequate education belongs to the state. It's the state's duty. It's not your school district's duty. The state delegates to the school district, but remains responsible for meeting the constitutional requirement. And since it's a state duty, the taxes to pay for education are state taxes. That's one of the key findings in the Claremont cases. And there's some basic, unchallenged, readily accepted constitutional law in New Hampshire that taxes have to be at the same rate throughout the taxing district. So if you have a municipal tax of $2, everyone in your town has to get charged $2. If it's a county tax, everyone gets charged the same in the county. And the state tax, everyone has to get charged the same. It has to be equal in valuation and and uniform in rate is the language of the Constitution. So if that's the requirement, let's go to a present day example. 2 homes, one in Fall Mountain, one in Newington. Fall Mountain is, or Charlestown, which is part of Fall Mountain, is the lower left of the state. Newington's on the right of the state at the ocean. Manufactured home versus a pretty colonial in Newington, who pays higher school taxes? Given it's me asking the question, I won't wait for you to answer. But that's the number. Those are the numbers. So remember, the first number that I used in my example, it's simple math, was $10 and $2 tax rate. In Charlestown, they have $500,000 available to tax per child. In Newington, they have almost 16 million. So it's a combination of the value of the property and the number of children. Right, but it makes it comparable. You can compare, it's a factor based on the number on the value available for each child. So you can compare apples to apples and control for communities of different size. So with that huge difference in property values, Charlestown imposes a tax rate that's more than 8 times Newington's. And then you just do the math. $100,000 property, manufactured home pays $1,864 a year in school taxes. The pretty colonial in Newington near the ocean pays $11.20.
I don't know if you're gonna get into this later, but one of the fallouts of this kind of system, I noticed when I worked in the Newport School District, is that the community members and the teachers and the educators, they all start fighting with each other, and it's really not their fault.
Right. It is not their fault. This system is established by the state.
They
And
get
there's
arms about each-
nothing that Fall Mountain School District can do to change the system. People in Charlestown can yell and scream that you're spending too much money. But because this number is so low and drives how Charlestown raises revenue, they can't overcome it. And this wealth in Newington, $16 million, none of it gets shared with any other community in the state. Of course, I don't know how many people have been to Newington, next to Portsmouth. You need to drive on the road to get there. There's federal highway money, there's state highway money. It's adjacent to the Pease development. I remember when we were litigating remedies in the Claremont case, there were a group of wealthy towns, including Newington, led by Portsmouth, who organized against changing anything. So they wouldn't help any of their neighbors. At the same time, Portsmouth asked the legislature to approve development bonds so that they could develop Pease into what it is today. So in some ways, the folks in Claremont, by guaranteeing bonds, helped Portsmouth move forward in their development, while at the same time, Portsmouth ignored the needs of the children of Claremont and Charlestown or communities.
So on the previous slide, the rate has to be the same. So
Yeah,
how is it that the rates can be so different? I guess that's the punchline of your presentation.
it is in part.
Okay,
So we all go home. So the question is, there are actually a couple of questions that this raises. What is a constitutionally adequate education? What are its component parts? And what does it cost? So if the 1864 tax rate for Charlestown was to pay for frivolities, things beyond constitutional adequacy, it doesn't matter so much that the rates are unequal. But if it's for the nub of what constitutes a constitutionally adequate education, they're clearly not uniform rates. And there's a huge constitutional problem.
So Andrew, do we know in how much was spent per pupil in each of those districts?
Yeah, Newington has its own elementary, has its own elementary and sends its kids to middle and high school in Portsmouth. And I think they spend about 19,000 and change. And Fall Mountain, I think, is in the 16, 17,000. So they even spend less, so there's a double whammy. So in 2018, my friends John Tobin and Doug Hall and I basically went on the road with a version of this presentation. We called it Ed Funding 101, and we did more than 50 presentations around the state, mostly at school districts at night. Some places we packed them in, like in Berlin, and some places like Portsmouth. A couple of people who would come. No one wanted to hear what we had to say, but it created an issue around the election. And the Democrats, who then were in charge of the legislature, had to respond to all of the hoopla we were raising on this issue. And so one of the things the Dems did, somewhat reluctantly, is they agreed to form and fund an education funding commission to look at how education is funded and suggest solutions. They hired a group called AIR, forgotten what it stands for, American something research, to staff their commission. And the whole process ended with a conclusion like this. So the system's inequitable, it's also unconstitutional, and districts serving the highest cost children, kids with the highest needs, had lower spending. This conclusion came short of recommending remedies, came short of addressing the problem. The commission included the chair and the vice chair of the House Education Committee. This is where we're going to be nonpartisan. They didn't get the job done. This was set up so that we could have a statewide discussion about how to finally remedy the situation. And it was like Lucy pulling the football away from Charlie Brown, because our people didn't do their job. And then there were some people, mostly Republicans, who didn't want to see any progress. And they carried the day with this commission. It was one of the more disappointing things in recent political activity. There's just another example of the inequity in the system. Portsmouth and Somersworth equalized valuation isn't as extreme as Newington and Charlestown. It's pretty serious though. And I included the spending in this one. So 19,000 versus 15,800, with the state average being 1834. That's a reported average by the Department of Education. That's only operating expenses. For some reason, it excludes transportation, debt, service, and capital expenditures. Those are another 3,000 a kid. So the real per pupil spending is about 21, 22,000. What's the difference between Portsmouth and Somersworth? About 25 miles. Except Portsmouth's on the ocean. Somersworth, it's an old manufacturing community. But when you look at what happens in these schools, there are some clear differences. in addition to just the monetary difference in spending. So high school graduation rates, proficiency levels, also a wealth difference in terms of income in those communities. Average teacher pays 26K more in Portsmouth. So if you're a good teacher and you have the ability to be mobile, this is the part that frosts me the most. Portsmouth is spending about $50,000 a year to hire lobbyists to maintain their privilege, to keep the system from changing. So Portsmouth and Somersworth, 25 miles apart, you have to drive from one to the next. The Rand case, which we're currently litigating, as Pete mentioned, includes some people from Pennacook. Pennacook is a part of Concord. It's a just historical anomaly that Pennacook is part of Merrimack Valley School District and not part of Concord School District. I think it had something to do with having kids commute from Pennacook downtown to go to school. Way back when the horses and carriages couldn't get there or whatever. So the equalized valuation per pupil, it should be, is double for the city of Concord versus Pennacook. Tax rate in Pennacook is 25% higher. Spending in Pennacook is $1,000, a little more than $1,000 less per child. So if you have 20 kids in a class, that's 20,000 less per class. The Democratic Speaker of the House, Steve Shurtleff, during many years. Anybody know where Steve's from? Pennacook. Has anyone ever heard the Speaker of the House, when he was Speaker or before, ever talk about this issue that so disadvantages his neighbors and their children?
What is the average number?
So the average at the bottom is, on average, the average wealth school district has 1.3 million
Across the state?
across the state.
Okay, thank you.
Average tax rate this year, which is 2020-21, was 1133, and the average operating per pupil cost was 18. Okay. This one's a little bit out of date because I don't know how to make the pie charts, and the person who made this made it 2 years ago, Doug Hall. That's where revenue comes from. Revenue now is spending on New Hampshire public schools is closer to 3.6 billion. Current terms. We list the local property tax and what's called SWEPT, statewide education property tax, in the same color, because SWEPT is really just renaming a portion of the local property tax. None of it goes to a central kitty. None of it gets redistributed. It's raised locally, goes to your town hall, and town hall kicks it over to your school district. It walks and quacks and sounds and looks like a duck, and it is. So remember, I asked you to remember how much of the Texas system revenues were reliant on property taxes. Remember, 50%. We're more like 73%. New Hampshire relies more on local property taxes than any other state in America. Yes.
Send me the new numbers on.
Oh, you'll do the pie chart for me? Okay,
Ken has reported.
go ahead, Ken.
Hey, Peter, where would, say, rooms and meals tax and the business taxes appear in the?
So portions of those monies flow through the education trust fund, and the education trust fund is here. The other.
And so when that piece of the pie gets smaller than the local property tax, like that's larger, right?
Yes. Or in the vernacular, downshift
Down.
happens. So when you cut when the legislature cuts the business profits tax, which is on the largest businesses that happen to have any interaction with our state, that money has to get made up somewhere else. And really, the only place to do it is the local property tax. Quick word on the lottery. All of the net proceeds from the lottery do go to education. They don't amount to much. They're typically between 2 and 3% of revenue. Not, but all those lottery commercials about education are just a little misleading. So this bar graph is where each state provides revenue to local school district. So it shows how much doesn't come from the local property tax. New Hampshire, all the way to the left. Hawaii and Vermont, all the way to the right. Massachusetts is about a quarter of the way. So even, I don't think the state deserves credit for SWEPT because it really is a local tax. But even if we gave them credit, we'd be 47 in terms of state tax contribution.
For clarification, so for instance, Vermont, is it high because they have equalized property? I mean, they take the property tax and spread it out, or I know I should know more about this.
No. Yeah, it's a great question because Vermont had the same lawsuit that we had at the same time. And it came out the same way, only Vermont's legislature and governor responded appropriately. So Vermont funds its schools with a combination of revenues from income tax, sales tax, and property tax. And even the property tax is done on a sharing basis. So they're, forgotten if it's called the Gold Coast, where all the ski areas are. High property values, few children. That wealth gets redistributed through a formula to help other parts of the state. Yep.
Can you point to Michigan's place, I think, let's see that.
It's fifth from the right.
There you go. Is it the fourth from the right?
Oh, there it is, right here. So Michigan
Yeah.
is about 65% state funded, which means there's a big common pot. And local property taxes make less difference.
Just quick side, when we lived in Michigan, very similar problem. Vast inequality across the state. In the 90s, legislation was passed that changed the pot to much more state distributed to equalize across the state.
Right. One of the claims in the Claremont case, which is being repeated in the Rand case, the one we're currently litigating, is that money doesn't make a difference. So the fact that some districts have less money to spend on their kids really has no impact. I was the one who got to cross-examine the expert in the Claremont trial, whose opinion that was, and it was fun.
And some states are poorer than other states. I mean, you know, I'm looking at South Dakota and they may, but New Hampshire is not.
So this is not how much is spent, but where the money comes from. So Mississippi is a poor state, dirt poor, but its share from
Right in the middle.
state spending is here, which means they're all poor together. Yeah.
We are not a poor state.
Right. So northern New England, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, of those states, who has the highest state and local tax burden? New Hampshire's the lowest of the three, yes, by a lot. Which of those three states is most dependent on property tax for revenues? New Hampshire. Oop, sorry. So we filed a new suit. Instead of representing children, I represent property taxpayers. One from Plymouth, which is 8-unit regional plus a couple of others, tuition in. Pennacook, part of Concord. Hopkinton is a wealthy income community and property poor community. They have a high tax rate, but by and large, they have the income to pay it, and they have one of the best school systems in the state. Newport is the fourth community, low wealth, income wise, and low value properties. So we've alleged that the average spending is 1834, the average non-operating, the debt, the transportation, et cetera, is 3,000. The state says adequacy is funded by 3709. And then there are a couple of add-ons, differentiated aid, which is what I was talking about with you, Tom, in those amounts. So if you have a child on free and reduced lunch, that school district gets an extra 1854. English language learners, SPED kids. If you have children with low test scores and they don't fit in one of those other three categories, you can get an extra 726. So if you can look at all the kids in the state, you look at the 3,700 plus differentiated aid to fit their demographics, the state contributes about 46,000 per child in the state. 4,600, sorry. When the average spend is about 21, 22. And this just came in the state's response to our lawsuit. That's the position we take. So the difference between 4,600 and 21, 22,000 is frivolous, unnecessary school services and buildings.
Things like busing and special music and art.
Music, art. So we, during the 2018 ed funding tours, we had Doug Hall work with the Pittsfield superintendent, who was a guy named John Freeman at the time. He's now in Stratford, really good guy, good superintendent. And we said, John, what would happen to the Pittsfield school district if you only relied on the state's money? Since they're supposed to pay for a constitutionally adequate education so children can compete in the marketplace of ideas. At the time, the average was 4630. And the average state spending per pupil was 16,000 instead of 18,000. So the percentage that the state paid for was a little higher at the time. So we said, John, cut your budget and tell us what it looks like in practical terms to go from what they pay to what you raise. So in this small rural school district, you have to cut all of that. When you get done cutting all that, you cut that too. And when you finish cutting this, you cut that as well. So you violated a couple of education laws, all of your collective bargaining agreements. You no longer can be accredited. And with doing all of that, you still don't get there. in order to get to the state's adequacy number, you have to have 60 students per teacher. Without benefits, and all the teachers paid at the entry level.
You wouldn't have any teachers.
You wouldn't have any teachers, you violate all of the sped laws, the accreditation standards, etc. So even though we're thought to have a really great state for education, and we have some national level high schools, public high schools, with places without a chemistry teacher. US News and World Report ranks high schools based on the test scores. They concluded none of the children graduated from Farmington or college ready. Manchester is the lowest spending school district in the state. Some of that is because its property values are so low and they have so many kids. Some of that is because they have a tax cap. So in part, Manchester's wounds are self-inflicted. But there's a group called Manchester Pride, formed by the local businesses in Manchester to improve the perception of Manchester education because they found they couldn't get their high-level employees to live in the city. Yep. So let's pause here before we go to the next topic. The other two topics are brief.
And maybe you're gonna just. Has anyone in America ever tried a separate but equal negation approach on the basis of class instead of race?
It's, so you're talking about Plessy, right? Plessy versus Ferguson, which was the law of the land for 50 years until Brown versus Board of Ed. We approved the fiction of separate but equal. We have that here. It's class-based more than race-based, but some of it's race-based because the two lowest spending districts are Manchester and Nashua. And they're the two communities with the largest racial diversity in the state.
My question was, has anyone ever tried that approach?
That's essentially what our case is.
Okay, oh. Where do I sign on?
Just to bring this a little closer to home, the problems that we see fairly locally in Franklin, just exactly like looking at the community with tax cap, the
First one. The first one in New Hampshire,
Mhm.
Brenda Alliance.
Yeah, and because of that, they are not able to offer competitive salaries to teachers, which means they don't get the best. They get, and so there's all kinds of difficulties, and the thing is interesting. Maybe talk to you later about the industry sponsored apprenticeship thing and trying to get going in Franklin.
So when we litigated the Claremont suit in the trial, we paired a property poor and a property wealthy community that was nearby so that you could really see in a concrete way the difference that money makes in the difference. So we compared Franklin and Guilford. The Guilford English department chair, well, we'll never forget, was named Retta Cologne. And she used to teach in Franklin. And Franklin couldn't afford a chair when she was senior, so she acted in that way. She testified that she can remember standing at the mail table, looking at resumes in Franklin and throwing away every resume for a teaching position where the applicant had more than 3 years experience. And when she moved to Guilford, unless they were doing some special project, they wouldn't look at applicants who had less than 3 years experience. That's the difference it makes. So, and can't remember the salary difference, but it was. It's like our modern day Summersworth, Portsmouth, 26K.
Or Danbury Elementary School, where there are 3 classrooms for 6 grades, only 10 employees, including the janitorial staff. And they can't retain anybody in the 3rd year, even the principal, because of the pay scale has to be so.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Just a request from the audience that any listeners from the audience.
Be repeated. Okay. I'll try and do that. Okay, so this is what the Rand case is about. There are other pressing issues with public education in New Hampshire. The biggest one is Frank Edelblut, period, end of sentence. He was nominated by the governor in my first term as an executive counselor. And the council was 3-2 Republican at the time, and 3 Republicans voted for him. I cross-examined him during the confirmation hearing and got a bunch of grief for it, but unfortunately, he's worse than I had expected.
Can I just give one quote? We just heard a presentation, but with when he spoke about education. And he said that there's research that shows that paying teachers more does not make any difference in educational outcome.
So
Like,
that
huh?
the comment is paying teachers more, according to Frank Edelblut, the education commissioner, doesn't make a difference in student outcome. There, on its face, it's ridiculous, but there are so many confounding factors. So the lowest paid teachers wind up in the schools with the lowest income students. So you have to control for that in some way. The kids who depend the most on education in a public school get taught by teachers who are paid the least. So moving that group of students upward is a chore. And not recognizing that as the education commissioner is an indictment of the commissioner, not of pay scales.
Yeah, one question about the Rand case, I was curious, the composition of the court has obviously changed a lot in the Supreme Court. I mean, do you have any reason to think, I don't really know the current court before. Do you have any reason to think that, you know, how is it disclosed for conditions?
It's hard to tell. I will say that when we litigated Claremont, going into it on its face, we thought it was a pretty tough conservative court. And we wound up getting 5 votes for the most part in every case. Sherman Horton from Nashua wound up dissenting a couple times. So I think you present them with the right kind of facts in the right legal context, and they do their jobs as judges. But there's 5 we have to deal with. So I don't have a choice. And I'm getting too old to put this off longer. All right, I want to mention 2 other things that should be on your education freedom account. You have a celebrity in your midst because the guy who wrote the article that I went to day before yesterday to get my facts is Gary Rayno. I also quoted from Forbes because Forbes is pretty conservative, business-oriented publication, and they pointed out how one-sided the turnout was when education freedom accounts were considered in the legislature, and how Frank Edelblut lied to everyone and told them it would be 130,000 in the first year and 3 million in the second year. It turned out to be 8 million in the second year and has doubled from that to 16 million. It is a system set up to be schemed. Right? You have to meet income eligibility in your first year when you apply. The number is 79.5 for a family of 4. They don't look at your assets. And they don't income qualify you after your first year. And it's administered by a private kind of opaque entity called the Children's Scholarship Fund. And there are those, Frank Edelblue and Republicans in the legislature, that would like to expand the program, make it available to more children with more funds. Now it's limited to the adequacy money. They would like to take it up to the per pupil spending amount. I knew I cited Gary. So those are the actual numbers. Over a year's time, it doubled from 1,500 to 3,000. And 3/4 of the kids who are getting this money were already in private school or being homeschooled, which means it's a subsidy. It's not education choice. All right, so there's going to be an effort to expand education freedom accounts. We need to be aware of that. And if you're inclined to push back against it, the other movement afoot is called unbundled services. Gets really technical, but basically the State Board of Education would like to rewrite the standards that schools have to comply with in a way that makes it easier for private contractors approved by the state, not the local school district, to provide specific services and to be paid for those services. There's a good webinar that Reaching Higher New Hampshire did. It's on their website. If you just Google Reaching Higher New Hampshire, you'll see it.
When you say,
Yeah, go ahead.
when you say providing services, including direct classroom educational services,
There,
not support services, but actually classroom teaching.
so part of the trick of it is to allow for teaching outside of the classroom and unapproved by the local district to count for class credit. So you can go to your local Prenda seminar and get your math there without any supervision locally of the quality, the scope, and terms of the education. There's some resources for you. Schoolfunding.info will give you national information about all of the school litigation across the country, as will the Ed Law Center. Ed Law is one of our partners in the Rand case, as is a big national firm called White Case. White Case is doing the case pro bono, as are John and Natalie and me. Reaching Higher is a good source. Fair Funding New Hampshire, good source and our partner. And some people who write really well on this topic are Gary, Mike Kitch, and Ethan DeWitt. And that's Claremont 2 on the left. So after the filing, 4 years later, the 32-year-old has her mouth open and her big sister is trying to pull her off to the left. Those are the three of us who are the New Hampshire components of the legal team. John Tobin, Natalie LaFlamme. Natalie was valedictorian at Berlin High School, and then went on to Georgetown and Duke Law. And she's moved back in the Southern case. So that's the presentation. I am happy to answer questions. I don't know, Jody, if you're gonna get emailed questions or chat questions. So what, go ahead, Ken.
You mentioned the possibility of them expanding this and I don't know if everybody's familiar with the HB 670, I think that did not succeed, but some of the things that it had in it were a 15-year guarantee of anybody that starts this voucher program will be carried all the way through it. Which would have the effect of completely bankrupting the local tax base. So, this is bigger than, I mean, it's big enough, it's an educational issue, but it's bigger than education because the effect of this kind of voucher system is to include local resources to do property taxes.
Complete your state, deplete your state resources, and then your local resources. So Ken Wells is saying that there's much more being done with vouchers potentially in the next term. And you may have, again, a Republican governor, a Republican Senate, a Republican House. If that happens, they'll have some opportunities to do that. Now, having said that, one of the strongest proponents of amending the Constitution to remove the education clause so that none of this would matter was John Lynch. Time after time after time. Jody and then
David, any ideas on the timeline of the current case? Where does it stand and how long before the final verdict?
Okay.
Thanks for all the work.
thank you. So we just received the state's answer to our complaint week before last. We have to, with the state, propose a schedule to the court. Generally, court schedules at this level are about a year from filing to trial. There are some things we're trying to do cooperatively with the state, getting a little innovative with their cooperation to move it more quickly. But still, by the time you go through the trial court and then an appeal to the New Hampshire Supreme Court, which is where this litigation ends, you're looking at a year and a half, 2 years. Yes.
In terms of political pressure, is there, I mean, one of the things that I found most striking is we relate some of these facts. The people who are most outraged are high school students themselves. And that goes across the board, whether they live in London and Ragstanch or Newport. The London kids thinking it's unfair that we and our parents are getting the double advantage versus the Newport kids.
Yeah.
And their parents, poor education and paying much higher taxes. Is there any scope in your view for organizing some of that outrage amongst high school students themselves?
So the question is there room to organize high school students to deal with this problem because they're already inclined to help? So two comments come to mind. When we did the Claremont trial and we're talking to students in the various schools, both poor schools and the wealthier schools, it was the student athletes who were most acutely aware of the problem because they were most likely to travel to other high schools and see facilities and some of the differences in facilities are just strong. When I ran for governor, I had a lot of support from the New Hampshire high school Dems. So there are some groups organized at that level. They assume there's a New Hampshire Republican Dems as well. Never dealt with them. But
Let's save my school.
Save Our Schools is, yeah, so Save Our Schools is kind of a grassroots group that's formed. I think it's more parents than high school students, but they're active as well. If you just Google Save Our Schools in New Hampshire, there's a woman, Jen Bisson, I think, from Bedford, who's very active as an organizer. But they have a presence on the web, and they also just turned in a petition asking Frank Edelblue to resign with 1,500 or so signatures on it, which is an unusual thing.
Or not. How do we address people who are homeschooling? They feel they have been trained twice.
So the question is, how do we, oh, shouldn't I have done this? How do we deal with people who are, I'll go further. How do we deal with people who are homeschooling, which means their child's not in the school system, retirees, young people, families without children? How do we deal with those communities that either don't have any kids or don't have a lot of kids? I think you need to think about what the purpose of public education is. In part, it's to educate a particular child who may or may not be your child. But in part, it's to create an educated populace to support democracy. So if you don't understand basic civics, if you don't read and write and think at a reasonable level, it's hard to participate in our democracy. And if all you're worried about is your child, when your child happens to be in school, you're missing the point. And so whether you have a child in the school system or don't, it's still your responsibility to have a vibrant system where families get brought together, where children get educated, where it's a resource for the community beyond just the child sitting in the chair. It's Thurgood Marshall in the San Antonio case went on quite eloquently about how you can't exercise your freedom of speech or your right to vote in a real and concrete and coherent way if you don't have a reasonable education that allows you to compete. Moreover, going to Ken's earlier comment about Franklin, if you don't have a reasonably good public school system, it's hard to attract business and people who are interested in education to your community.
Yeah, no, I can see people saying that the increase in online education options, that education should be getting cheaper because there's so many options that are out there that don't require teaching facilities and so forth. But now you see after the pandemic how school success has plunged nationwide, and there's like a real crisis with students who are on. So I don't know if that's an argument that's being introduced that it needs to be shot down before it gets really too much.
Well, it's part of Frank Edelblue's art, right? And the people who want to unbundle services. I'd recommend a book. It's called Cutting School by a professor named Noelle Rooks, Rooks. And her basic proposition is all of those innovative education, entrepreneurial educational services. How many wealthy districts rely on them? And if they won't have them, why do you do it to the poor kids? And are the poor kids' schools failing because they don't have the resources they need? So you creating the problem so that you can then solve it through entrepreneurial education.
There's a whole mental health crisis
Absolutely.
as well with students who've not socialized and,
Absolutely.
as well.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Okay, what else? The last question.
If I could just comment on Peter's question, we don't appreciate. I'm a teacher for 37 years, but people don't appreciate the difference between information and education. We have easy access to lots of information, But education is, socialization is based on a personal relationship. And you can't do that effectively on a computer screen until a student gets to the point in their educational career, which is quite advanced, where they can school themselves. And we're not getting there.
Any more questions?
We're 5 minutes over. Watch for the Rand case, read people like Gary and Mike Kitch to find out what's going on in the case. We'll keep them posted. The Fair Funding Project actually posts our litigation documents. So if you're interested in actually reading what we filed and the details of what the state has responded with, they're posted there, fairfundingnh.org. Thank you.
I got this fancy wrapping paper just for you. Little thank you. Isn't it? This is from Wilmot because it's the best.
Well, so I have a sugar.
Well, it's the second best.
All
It's
right.
the best we have. Let's put it that way. But I want to
Thank you.
I want to thank everybody here. I want to thank those on Zoom. Again, the Wilmot Community Association, there's some literature on the table here. There's a sign-up sheet. There's also, wait. We got to do it right. There's also a sign-up sheet for the Wilmot Democrats, if you want us to tell you about upcoming events. And we thank you all. We hope to share this information with the neighbors. Snacks. Cheers. Chocolate cake, cookies, things to drink. Help yourself, please. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for making the time for us.
And this is great.
Well,
There's never enough.
All whiskey.
Yeah, well, that's when you speak. Jim.
Whoa.
Okay.
There you go.
happens to shake hands, all right?
Does I'm wondering if Pete wants my slides.
Kimberly. Since you're the electronic wizard here.
Do you have my slides on my slide deck? If you'll put it to use.
I think you would, wouldn't you?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Thank you very much.
So this isn't my computer.
Thank
So-
you for putting this
I'll
on.
let
This is,
Jody
very
share it
interesting.
somewhere
We've done one on
But
environment.
you're welcome to have it put it up.
How about one on healthcare?
It's not-
That's our first.